The anniversary card was still sitting unopened on the passenger seat of her car when Diane Kessler realized her husband of 31 years had already given her his gift for the evening, and it wasn't the one she thought. Across the dining room of the Copper Kettle, under warm amber light and the low clatter of forks against china, a man in a dark sport coat leaned across a small table and pressed his mouth to another woman's cheek, then lower, to her jaw, in the unhurried way of someone who has done this before and expects to do it again. His phone, at that exact moment, was lighting up in his wife's hand 3 tables away, with a message that read, "Stuck at the office. Happy anniversary, babe. Love you." Diane Kessler did not gasp. She did not drop her glass or knock back her chair. She sat very still, the way a woman sits when her body understands a thing several seconds before her mind is willing to. And when the woman across the room finally turned her face into the candlelight, Diane recognized her immediately, not as a stranger, not as some faceless conquest, but as the young woman who had sat in her own kitchen 4 nights earlier, stirring a cup of tea, saying she hoped this anniversary would finally give Walter a chance to rest because he'd been working himself to the bone lately. Her son's wife, working herself into his lap instead. By the end of this story, a lab envelope changes hands over that same table. A waiter risks his job to stop a woman from making a mistake, and a mother has to decide whether the truth she's about to hand her son will heal him or break something in him that never grows back. But before we go further, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We'd love to know. And if stories like this one keep you up thinking, hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next. Millbrook, Ohio is the kind of town where everybody's business eventually makes its way to the diner counter, whether they wanted to or not. Walter Kessler had spent 3 decades building a name there, a respected contractor, a deacon's handshake, a man people trusted to show up on time and finish what he started. His wife Diane had built something quieter but no less solid, a home, a son raised right, and a 31-year marriage she had never once thought to question. Their son Nathan had married Paige 2 years earlier, in a ceremony Diane had planned down to the last centerpiece. Paige had folded into the family easily, a little too easily, some might say now, looking back. She learned everyone's coffee order within a month. She remembered birthdays. She called Diane Mom before anyone asked her to. So when Diane's own eyes told her that her husband and her daughter-in-law were sharing a private dinner 3 tables away from her anniversary reservation, 3 questions rose up that would not let her go for the rest of that night. How long had this been happening? Why had the 2 of them chosen, of all restaurants in Millbrook, the very one Walter had proposed in 33 years earlier? And what, exactly, was inside the sealed envelope a stranger was about to hand her husband before the night was through? Walter Kessler had never been a flashy man, and that was part of what made him easy to trust. He built decks and additions and the occasional custom garage for half the families in Millbrook, and he did it with a handshake instead of a lawyer most of the time. Because in a town that size, your word was still worth something. He coached Nathan's Little League team for 6 seasons. He mowed the Hendersons' lawn next door for 2 years after Mr. Henderson's knee surgery, and never once mentioned it to anyone, which was exactly the kind of quiet decency Diane had built her whole understanding of him around. Diane herself had spent 22 years teaching 3rd grade at Millbrook Elementary before retiring 4 years back, and she still ran into former students, grown now, with children of their own, at the grocery store, all of them calling her Mrs. K, the way they had at age 8. She kept a garden she was proud of, sat on the library's fundraising committee, and had, for 3 decades, organized her entire emotional life around the belief that Walter Kessler was a solid, uncomplicated man who loved her in the plain, unglamorous way of someone who'd simply decided a long time ago that this was his family and he wasn't interested in anything else. Nathan had grown into a version of his father that Diane liked better in some ways. Same steadiness, same quiet humor, but softer around the edges, quicker to say, "I love you," out loud, instead of just building something to prove it. He worked in facilities management for a hospital system in Dayton, 40 minutes east, which meant 12-hour shifts some weeks and long stretches where he came home too tired to notice much of anything. Paige had come into the family by way of a coworker introduction, all soft edges and good manners, the kind of young woman who complimented your cooking and meant it, or seemed to. She and Nathan married in the Kessler backyard under string lights. Diane had spent 2 weekends hanging herself. In the 2 years since, Paige had become, by every visible measure, a devoted wife and an increasingly present daughter-in-law, stopping by on weekday afternoons when Nathan worked late, dropping off soup when Diane had a cold, sitting with Walter on the back porch some evenings while Nathan was still on shift, the two of them laughing over something on his phone. Diane had thought that was sweet. She had said so, more than once, to friends at church. She had no framework, no reason on earth, to read those porch evenings as anything other than what they appeared to be, a father-in-law and daughter-in-law who simply got along. There had been small things, in hindsight, that Diane's mind had filed away without examining. Walter had started stepping outside after dinner some nights to take calls he described as subcontractor stuff. Paige had begun canceling on family dinners with a regularity that always seemed to land on the same nights Walter mentioned running late from a job site. Neither fact had meant anything on its own. Diane had spent 31 years training herself not to read absence as evidence, because a marriage built on suspicion was, in her experience, a marriage that ate itself alive from the inside. She had chosen trust instead. On the night of their 31st anniversary, that choice was about to cost her everything she thought she understood about her own life. Diane arrived at the Copper Kettle 25 minutes early, the way she always did, because Walter ran late more often than he used to, and she'd rather sit alone with a glass of water than stand at the hostess stand looking abandoned. She'd worn the green dress he'd once told her he liked, ordered a water with lemon, and told herself the same small lies she always told herself in those stretches of waiting. Traffic, a client call, a man who'd simply lost track of time because he worked so hard. His text came in at 7:42. Stuck at the office. Happy anniversary, babe. Love you. Diane read it twice, felt the familiar small disappointment settle into her chest, and was in the middle of composing a gracious reply when something made her look up. Not instinct exactly, more a kind of restlessness in the room, the way you sense a draft before you feel it. 3 tables away, at the corner booth Walter had once proposed to her beside, a man in a dark sport coat sat with his elbow near a candle, his body angled toward a young woman across from him with an ease that had nothing hurried in it. Diane's first thought was simply that the man had good posture, the unbothered comfort of someone who had nowhere else he needed to be. Her second thought arrived a half-second later and split her chest wide open. That was Walter's jacket. That was Walter's watch. That was Walter. And the woman leaning toward him, unbothered, unhurried, was Paige. Diane did not breathe correctly for what felt like a full minute. She watched her husband lower his mouth to her daughter-in-law's cheek, then her jaw, in a gesture so unrushed it could only have been practiced, the kind of touch that belongs to people who have long since stopped being nervous around each other. Diane's hand was still holding the phone with his text glowing on the screen. Stuck at the office. The cruelty of it wasn't even in the lie. It was in how easily it had come out of him. She stood up before she decided to. Her chair scraped hard against the floor, loud enough that a couple at the next table glanced over, and Diane was 3 steps into the room, her pulse roaring in her ears, when a hand closed gently around her forearm. It was their server, a younger man, mid-30s, calm dark eyes, an apron still tied around his waist. "Ma'am," he said quietly, low enough that only she could hear him over the clatter of the room. "Please, give it a second." "Let go of me," Diane said, though her voice came out steadier than she felt. He didn't tighten his grip, but he didn't step aside either. "I've seen them here before," he said. "If you go over there right now, I think you'll regret how it goes." Diane stared at him. Of everything she might have expected in that moment, A stranger's warning was nowhere on the list. "Seen them here? Before?" she repeated, and something in his face, not smugness, something closer to pity, told her he meant it exactly the way it sounded. She looked back at the booth. Walter had leaned back into his seat. Paige was saying something to him, low and unhurried, her face utterly composed. Neither of them glanced toward the door, or the room, or the mirrors along the bar, the small, constant vigilance of people who believe they might be caught. There was none of it. They looked, Diane realized with a cold drop in her stomach, like two people who had stopped worrying about being seen a long time ago. That was what made her sit back down, not the waiter's hand on her arm, the absence of fear on their faces. If she stormed over now, she would hand them chaos, and chaos was a gift to people who'd already rehearsed their excuses. She wanted something colder than a scene. She wanted to understand exactly what she was looking at before she let either of them know she'd seen it. So she sat, hands folded too neatly in her lap, and watched. 15 minutes later, a man she vaguely recognized approached their table. Mid-50s, wire-frame glasses, a leather portfolio under one arm, moving with the unhurried certainty of someone expected. Walter rose halfway to greet him, the kind of half-standing men do for someone they've met with before, someone requiring no introduction. Diane's memory clicked into place a beat later. 2 years earlier, Walter had mentioned needing independent verification on something and had met privately with a consultant who handled discrete lab work for people who didn't want results running through a family doctor's office. The man opened his portfolio and produced a sealed brown envelope, unmarked, and placed it directly into Walter's hand. Not Paige's, not both of theirs, Walter's. He tore it open without hesitation, the way a man reads for a single answer he has already been living with, scanned the page once, and exhaled. Not shock, not confusion. Relief. "So it's confirmed," Walter said, low enough that Diane had to read it as much from his mouth as hear it. Confirmed. Not discovered. Not a surprise. A closing of a loop that had clearly been open for a long while before Diane had ever sat down at that table. Walter stood, crossed to Paige's side of the booth, and rested his hand flat against her stomach. Not a searching gesture, not tentative, familiar. He bent and pressed his mouth to the same spot. Quiet, unhurried, private, despite the room full of strangers around them. Diane sat with her water sweating onto the linen and understood, all at once, and without a single word spoken to her, that her daughter-in-law was pregnant, that her husband already knew it, and that whatever this was, it had not started tonight. Diane drove home with the windows down and the radio off, and when she pulled into the driveway, she sat in the car for 11 minutes before she trusted her hands enough to turn the key. Walter's shoes weren't by the door when she let herself in, a small, meaningless detail on any other night, and on this one, a puzzle piece she filed away without comment. She was in her reading chair with an unopened book in her lap when he came home an hour later, tie loosened, entirely unhurried. "There you are," he said, like she'd simply beaten him home from some harmless errand. He crossed the room, bent to kiss her cheek, and Diane let his mouth touch her skin with the same casual affection it had used for 31 years. Because a woman who has just learned the shape of her own life does not always have the luxury of falling apart on schedule. "Work was a mess," he said, dropping into the chair across from her. "We'll celebrate properly this weekend. I'll make it up to you. We." The word moved through her, like something gone bad in the refrigerator. She studied him, not as the man she'd chosen at 27, not as the father who'd taught Nathan to shave, but as a stranger whose habits she suddenly needed to learn fast, for her own protection. She made her first decision that night. She would not confront him. Confrontation would serve her pain. Silence would serve her understanding. And understanding, she suspected, was going to require time she hadn't yet spent. Over the following days, Diane stopped filing small oddities away as harmless and started laying them end to end. The evening phone calls Walter took outside. Always on nights, Nathan worked a late shift. The joint account statements, which showed nothing enormous, but a pattern of withdrawals too regular to be accidental. Job site expenses, always tidy, always just below the threshold that would make a woman ask questions. A folder in the study she'd never had reason to open, containing a transfer schedule, moving money, in small increments, into an investment account Walter had opened 8 months earlier and never mentioned. She went back to the Copper Kettle 2 days later, in the quiet hour after the lunch rush, and asked the hostess for the server, who'd stopped her from crossing the room. He came out a few minutes later without his apron, clearly uneasy at being found. "I'm not here to get you in trouble," Diane told him on the side patio, both of them standing, because neither felt entitled to sit. "I need the truth." His name, she learned, was Miles. He'd been working there just under a year. "They've been coming in for months," he admitted finally, after a long silence. "Same section every time. Not exactly hiding, just not making a show of it either." He hesitated, then added the sentence that finished what remained of Diane's denial. "I thought you already knew. It wasn't the first time I'd seen them like that." Diane thanked him and drove home with that sentence sitting in the passenger seat beside her, like a second passenger. Months. Not a single lapse in judgment. A structure, something built, maintained, and apparently comfortable enough that 2 people had stopped bothering to check the room. She waited 2 weeks before calling her son, not out of doubt, but out of care for the order in which the truth arrived. She knew that if Nathan heard this in fragments, or heard it from someone crueler than his own mother, the pain would land on him with no shape to hold on to. She wanted to hand it to him whole and steady, even if steady was the last thing she felt. She asked him to meet her at the Copper Kettle on a Thursday evening. He arrived exactly on time, scanning the room with the open, trusting look of a man who still believed the world was arranged roughly the way he'd last understood it. He kissed her cheek, slid into the booth, frowned. "You sounded strange on the phone." "I need you to listen all the way through," Diane said. "You're scaring me." "I know," she told him plainly. No cushioning, no easing in, because softness at that point would have only prolonged the wound. She told him what she'd seen 2 weeks earlier, his father, at that same table, with his wife. Nathan's first reaction was disbelief dressed up as defense. Maybe it was a client. Maybe you misread it. The reflex of a man reaching for an easier story before the true one could finish arriving. When Diane told him she'd watched Walter kiss Paige, watched the envelope change hands, watched his father's palm settle against a stomach that did not belong to his mother, Nathan's face went through every stage of a man's world, quietly ending. Confusion, refusal, and finally, when Diane set her phone on the table between them, with the photograph she'd taken, without fully realizing her own thumb had moved, silence. He looked at the image once, then a second time, his jaw working, his breath shortening. "That's not," he started, and couldn't finish it. "She's pregnant," Diane said quietly, "and the child isn't yours." For one long moment, Nathan Kessler forgot how to breathe. What Nathan said first, once his breath came back, was not what Diane expected. "I'm going to kill him," he said, flat, stripped of theater, more impulse than threat. "No," Diane said, "you're going to survive this, and so am I, but not by handing them the satisfaction of watching us fall apart in public." It took her most of that night at the restaurant to convince him. What finally landed wasn't comfort, it was strategy. If Walter and Paige believed they were still undiscovered, they would keep behaving exactly as they had been, careless, unguarded, certain of their own safety. The moment either of them suspected they'd been seen, they would tighten up, cover their tracks, and Diane and Nathan would lose whatever evidence remained loose and careless in the world. So mother and son made a pact that night. No confrontation, no accusation, no warning. Let them feel safe. People show you everything when they believe they're protected. It worked exactly as Diane predicted, and it was, she would say later, one of the ugliest lessons of her life. watching two people relax back into carelessness the moment they believed themselves unwatched. Paige grew visibly lighter around Nathan within days, laughing easier, leaving her phone face up on the counter, and on the third night, she nearly slipped, answering a question about her evening plans a beat too quickly before correcting herself. Walter, for his part, became gentler around the house, bringing Diane coffee, mentioning a weekend getaway they should finally take. Every kindness now landing in Diane's ears as a man keeping one household comfortable while quietly furnishing another. The larger pieces surfaced within the month. Nathan, looking for a phone charger in the spare room he and Paige used as a home office, found a folder left carelessly unzipped. A lease agreement for a townhouse in a new development on the east side of Dayton, the kind of quiet, comfortable street chosen by people who wanted privacy without questions. The lease began in 6 weeks. The name on it wasn't Paige's, it was Walter's. Diane, going back through the study drawer with new eyes, found the transfer schedule she'd glimpsed weeks earlier and finally understood it for what it was. Money moving steadily out of the joint account she and Walter had shared for 3 decades and into an account meant, it was now painfully clear, to fund a second life running quietly alongside the first. Not an affair in the ordinary sense, a replacement, already under construction, already partly moved into. Diane called Desmond Cole, the attorney who had handled the Kesslers' estate paperwork years earlier, and asked for a meeting, framed, deliberately, as a routine question about some account discrepancies. She wanted Walter walking into that office off balance just enough to keep talking, and comfortable enough not to suspect the ground had already shifted beneath him. The meeting took place on the 3rd floor of a brick office building on Main Street, in a conference room with straight-back chairs and no photographs on the walls. A room built for process, not memory. Diane sat beside her attorney with a stack of folders in front of her. Nathan sat beside his mother, jaw set, composed by decision rather than peace. Walter entered first, then Paige, both under the impression they were there to discuss estate paperwork. Walter slowed half a step at the sight of the folders arranged on the table. The first hesitation Diane had ever seen reach him before he could smooth it away. "What is this?" he asked. "Sit down," Diane said. Desmond Cole did not raise his voice. He simply began placing documents on the table, one at a time, spaced enough to force the room's attention onto each one before moving to the next. Joint account transfer summaries, the townhouse lease, a timeline Diane and Nathan had built together, dates and overlaps that no longer looked like coincidence once laid end to end. And finally, last, the photograph, Walter's hand resting against Paige's stomach in the dim light of the copper kettle, placed face up on the table without comment. The room went silent in a way that had weight to it. Paige's hand rose to her mouth and then dropped, the gesture giving away exactly what it was meant to hide. Her eyes went to Nathan, searching. He gave her nothing. Walter recovered fastest, the way men who build second lives usually do, having rehearsed calm for exactly this kind of moment. "Diane," he said, low, reasonable, the tone he'd used for 31 years to turn arguments back into something manageable. "Whatever you think this is, it's exactly what it is," Diane said. "You didn't just betray me, you built a future on it." She let that settle before she added, "And you did it with money that was supposed to be both of ours, in a house neither of us had any say in choosing." Desmond Cole outlined, evenly, what the documents established. A pattern of undisclosed financial movement, a second residence already under lease, conduct that carried real weight depending on how the divorce and any related claims proceeded. Nothing about it was dramatic. It didn't need to be. Real consequence, Diane would come to understand in the months that followed, rarely announces itself with shouting. It shows up in delayed callbacks, in board positions that quietly don't get renewed, in a partnership that shifts direction after internal review, in doors that close softly enough that no one outside the family ever hears them shut. Diane filed for divorce within the week. The process crawled, the way these things do, through requests for clarification and documents that took longer than they should have, but every step of it moved through council now, which meant personality no longer had anywhere to hide. The townhouse lease, once meant to be a fresh start, became instead a permanent line in the record, proof that this had never been a lapse in judgment, but a plan already in motion. Nathan ended his marriage cleanly, without spectacle, the same restraint his mother had modeled for him in that first conference room. Paige moved out gradually, without ceremony, and no one in the family called to bring her back. Walter did not vanish from Millbrook, but he moved through it differently afterward, more carefully, more formally, the way people move when they've become a known risk rather than a known quantity. Nobody in town needed to call him a disgrace out loud. Respectability, Diane had learned, doesn't collapse all at once. It simply stops being handed to you as easily as it once was. Nathan took the longest to come back to himself. Quieter for a while, sleeping poorly, some days barely speaking, but he kept showing up to work. He kept answering the phone, eventually, and on an ordinary afternoon months later, over lunch with his mother, he laughed at something small enough that it startled them both. The first sound of him finding his footing again. Diane didn't come out of it triumphant. She came out of it clear. She stopped measuring her strength by how much she could make either of them suffer, and started measuring it instead by how little of her peace they still had access to. What was the harder truth for her to sit with? That the two people closest to her had been capable of it, or that she'd spent months learning to watch, wait, and hold her silence until the moment truth could stand entirely on its own? If you were sitting in Diane Kessler's chair that night, if you looked up from your phone and saw what she saw, would you have stayed seated and watched, the way she did? Or would you have crossed that restaurant floor the second you understood what you were looking at? There's no clean answer to that question, and maybe that's exactly the point. Some betrayals ask you to feel first. This one asked Diane to think first, and to keep thinking, for weeks, before she ever let her husband or her daughter-in-law know how much she already understood. Tell us in the comments what you would have done in that dining room. Confront them on the spot, or do exactly what Diane did, and wait until the truth could stand on its own 2 feet, with no room left for anyone to talk their way around it. We read every one of your comments, and honestly, some of the most powerful moments in these stories come from what you all share about your own lives. If tonight's story stayed with you, our next one might sit with you even longer. A story about a woman who spent 40 years believing she'd raised an only child, until a stranger showed up at her husband's funeral, holding a photograph that changed everything she thought she knew about her own family. That one's coming soon, so if you don't want to miss it, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, and turn on notifications so you're the first to know when it drops. Thank you for spending this hour with Hidden Yet Heard Tales. We'll see you in the next one.